Okay, so let's go through a presentation here on the on using Redux with React. Okay, and this is the most trivial example I could come up with. Right? I think you'll be able to capture it. Right? I think in 10 slides you'll get the idea of Redux. Right? Everything else, right, will be how do you scale this idea? How do you scale this very simple trivial idea? Right? How do you scale that in large applications, which is non-trivial? Right? So the hard part will be extending this idea to large applications. Right? But the simplest idea, the trivial one, is to capture first what the essence, what the concept is. Right? So let's go over it. First of all, let's build a little app where we can play around with some of these ideas. All right. So let's create a React app. A trivial React Redux example. All right, so let's make a directory for lectures. And let's create a trivial React Redux example. All right, so while that is deploying, this is what we're going to be building just in this first set of slides. Okay? Basically, we're going to just have a trivial component, right, that's just going to have a single button. Right? So you can click on it and something's going to happen. And what's going to happen here is that the component is going to dispatch some events or an action, right? And a reducer, right, is going to handle that action. Right? What it's going to do, the reducers, is that it's going to take the current state of the application, right, and depending on the action, is going to generate a brand new state. It's not going to change the state. The state of the application is going to stay unchanged. It's unmutable. We say that the state is unmutable. Instead, it's going to create a brand new state based on the previous state and the action. And it's going to store this state information in what is called a store. Okay? If you're familiar with a model view controller, you might use some analogies on what some of the roles here are. Right? The view, well, that's the same, right? In model view controller. In dispatcher is somewhat what you might find to be a controller, right? That it's handling events and sending them over to somebody who's going to handle these events, right? That's processing user input and updating and dispatching who it goes to. Reducer is more or less what the model might be, right? Or the manipulation of the model or the service, right? That's taking this data and is manipulating the data. But here, we're not manipulating the state. Instead, we're creating a brand new one. Right? And then it's being stored in storage for then re-rendering. So let's focus first on this pipeline, right? How to build this pipeline. Right? We'll then focus and say, okay, well, once the state has been created, well, how do I display it? How do I display this brand new state? We'll do that in the next couple of slides. So let's first look at this trivial example. Let's see, is this done? All right, so if we go to the trivial example and we do npm start, this should boot up the default application. There it is. All right, so let's open it up in our favorite IDE. So we are in webdev lectures. There it is. Let's open it up. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is blow away the content in that directory. All right. So we're going to create our own implementation from scratch. All right. So first of all, we'll need to install a couple of things. All right, we'll install two libraries. The Redux library, right, that's the base library that's the same for all frameworks. All frameworks, not only React, but all frameworks use just Redux. Right? again, Redux is not React specific. You can use it with jQuery, with Angular, with any other framework. You can use Redux. And so we'll need to install a second library here that loads our hooks to be able to have React talk to use this Redux library. Okay. So let's install Redux. Don't forget the -- save. No, sorry. Copy. And then we'll install React Redux. And meanwhile, we can blow away the content here of the source directory. And then we can install React Redux. Okay, so that's very good. So I think we're ready to get started with the boilerplate content. Right. First, we'll load the React and React DOM. Right, in an index file. So let's create here the index. So this is index.js. And in here, let's import both React and React DOM. We don't need those just yet, but let's load it anyway. So before I forget, okay, we don't need those just yet. Notice that they're not being used anywhere. That's why they're all grayed out. Let's see if we can create just a trivial component. Let's create a sum component. Notice that this is very, very generic. Right? Notice it says sum component, right? Any component that you might want to create. And so let's add a brand new component. There it is, sum component, and presumably has this button that you click on it and it does something. Right? And let's render it. We can say React DOM render and render sum component in document dot get element by ID and in root. Okay. Let's see if we can re-render this. We need to start it. Oh, we didn't. It's gonna complain. Oh no, there it is. Okay. There's a button. Our button doesn't do anything yet. If I click it, it'll probably complain. Yeah, it complained, right? Because it's not connected to anything, right? But let's take a look at what it says, right? This says, so somebody is going to pass me a dispatch argument, right, as a property. Somebody's going to pass it to me, and we talked about parameterizing components before, right? Right? Somebody's going to pass it to me, and when the button is clicked, right, it's going to call that function, right? So notice you see the arrow function saying an event is going to be generated when the on-click it gets called. We're not going to use the event for anything, but it's the argument, and that's a function in there, and it's going to call the dispatch function. And it's going to pass some JSON object there. See that? Right, we call that JSON object an action. The object itself, we call it an action. And an action has one single required attribute, right? The type. That's the only required attribute of an action, right? It allows it to, so that we can uniquely identify one action from another action. Right? And presumably there will be some descriptive text in there that presumably captures what it is the action that you want to do. Right? Here is some action. Right? So notice that this won't work just yet. Right now, we could just do an alert, perhaps. We can say alert hello. Oops. Oh, am I missing something? Right, hello. right? So if I click it, it just calls that function in there. Everybody okay? Right? But what we want to do is call this function dispatch, and instead we want to pass in some JSON object that says a type. The type of the object, to distinguish it from other objects, has some action. Okay. All right. So to who's going to pass me this? Who's going to pass me that? Right? Redux is going to pass me that. Redux, as part of the framework, is going to pass me that function. How does it pass it? Well, we have to connect it to Redux. Right? So how do we do that? Is that we say we use the connect function, connect some component. Right? We say connect is part of the Redux React framework. We say connect, and then you pass it as argument several mappers, which we don't know what that is in a minute. We'll see what you can pass as an argument. And that returns a function that you can then pass it the name of the component that you want to connect to. Okay? And so now it's connected. But before we connect it, there's several configurations that we can add to it, and that would go in a parent container, which we don't have in a minute. We can put it inside of a parent container. Right, and then just render that container. We can render that container. Right. So what's going to happen here is that this is going to generate the dispatch. Right, it's going to generate this here. It's the component view. When I click, it's going to generate. Right, the dispatch is going to generate the action, and it's going to send that action to a reducer. Reducer is going to take that action, is going to do something with it. All right. So we have this first part, right, of the component generating or dispatching an action, right? But we don't have anybody who's listening to it. So let's create the reducer that can listen to that. Let's create the reducer. So here's a reducer. So let's create the reducer right here. The const sum reducer. It's going to be a function. Also, you'll notice that I'm making heavy use of stateless components. Remember last week we said that there were two types of components that you could use, right? The stateful components, where it had constructors, it had a super, right? It has the this.state, and you could put all the state inside of the component. And there was the stateless components. Remember that? Right? And that's exactly what we want to do. What we want to do is that we don't want components to handle their own states. These are going to be very dumb components. Right? They're only going to render what they're told. Somebody's going to pass them the state and say, hey, render this. You're not going to be responsible for maintaining your own state. Someone else is going to handle the state for you. And they're going to pass it to you whenever you need to render it. Right? It's no longer your role, your responsibility of maintaining state. Instead, you notify the centralized state handler, right? And it will keep track of all the state for you. Right? And that's exactly what's happening here. We still have a ways to go, but this is notifying the state handler that something should happen to that state, right, based on this action, whatever it is. We don't know what it is yet. And we're trying to hook it up. Here's where we hooked it up, and it's going to handle it and send it over to this reducer. The reducer takes as argument the previous state, right, and some action. And based on that state and the action, it will decide what new state should be. Right? The previous state might be that you had these widgets, right? This list of widgets, and the action might be delete a widget. And so the reducer, looking at the prior list of widgets and looking at the action to delete a widget, right? It will search that array, right, for the widget. It will generate a brand new list of widgets, okay, without that widget that we're removing. It'll create a brand new object without that widget in there. Make sense? If the action would be to add a widget, it would take your old array of widgets and it'll create a brand new one with the new widget added in there. Make sense? All right, so that's so the reducer has the responsibility of taking the old state, looking at the action, right, and then generating a brand new state. Okay. So the way this works is that the reducer is just one big switch statement. It looks at the action type, and based on the action type, it decides what to do. Right? If the type is some action, right, that's exactly what we're passing. Notice that's what we were dispatching. See that? We're dispatching that. Right now, let's just do something really, really dumb, and we're just going to do an alert. Some action was dispatched. Just to make sure that we were getting here, okay, that's hooked up, right? And the other is that we're going to have a default. If none of the actions matched, well, I'm just going to return the old state, right? Nothing happened to a state. If none of the actions matched, I'm just going to give you the same state that we were earlier, right? I'm going to return the old state, okay? If it matched the some action, I can return maybe a new state. I can say return, and the new state is whatever I want it to be, whatever I care. So I can add some new attribute with some new state, and that has some meaning to me, whatever that means. Right? Reducer doesn't care. You generate this, whatever logic you were using to generate this state. All power to you. Okay. All right. Also, it's often useful to initialize the state with something, right? Some default initial state. For instance, it might be that when I'm going to render this, my initial state might be the default list of widgets that is already in the database. That might be a good place to start, right? I might go to the database, return the current list of widgets, and this would be my initial state. Yes? All right? Or my default state. If I don't have a state, this is my default state. So this might be some default attribute with some default state. Okay? Again, this is all something that means to me in my logic. All right, so I have a state, I have a default state, I have a reducer, and that's it. Let's see where am I missing? I might have broken something. All right, now we have these pieces here. We have the component generate dispatching some action, reducer handling that dispatch, generating a brand new state. Now we need to put it in the store, right? Ready to be rendered. Although we can't render it just yet, we have to create the store. The store, it's listening to what's happening at the reducer. It's going to take the reducer, and based on the states that the reducer generates, it's going to populate the store for us. So let's do that. Let's create the store. We'll create a new store, some store. I'm doing it very, very generic. I guess this should have been, okay, here's the container. There's my store, taken from the reducer. And then now that we have a store, we have to provide that store to the app, right? Which is currently the app is made up of just a container. Okay, so we can feed this with the provider. We need to provide our app with a store and provide it to the child component. Okay? All right, this is a lot of plumbing. All right, this is just a lot of plumbing. Just have to fit all the things together, right, and connect them. All right. Once it's plumbed, right, then you don't have to do this ever again. This is the tedious part of this is setting up the plumbing. Right? After the setup, you could just concentrate on the actions and how the state is generated, what the logic is, and whatnot. That's the fun part, right? The boring part is setting up the plumbing, right? But again, that's usually where things go wrong at the beginning, where these kinds of things. And Actually, here we instead of, okay, I guess this should work. Let's see. Let's see. Is it complaining about anything? Okay, there it is. Notice that I clicked on the button, and we're hitting that alert. All right, see that? So we are in Reducer. We are in the Reducer. Okay, Reducer just received that dispatch, right? It went into that case, right, and did the alert, and it's now returning some dummy new state, which we're not doing anything with it. Right? It's returning that new state, and it's putting it in the store. Right? But we're never doing anything with that element in that store. Right? So the next part might be, well, what do you do with that new state? Right? Presumably that new state, you want to render it somewhere. Okay? So let's see how we could do that next.